Chimdindu, Ohayagha. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. A little bit of a rocky start of my week, just due to hurricane season here where I am, but now everything is pretty good. So I'm doing pretty good.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm really glad to hear that. Yeah. So I want to say I am really honored to have you. This is very unique for me because of all the people who have graced my virtual studio. You're definitely, I think, the one in her earliest career stage. So I think it's really unique and really cool, and will add a different perspective to these conversations. I also am really grateful because you made time during this kind of free week you have, because you have some exciting new horizons coming up. Do you want to tell everyone about that?
Yeah, sure. So I am starting my psychology internship in 2 days, actually on Monday. So I'll be embarking on my last kind of leg until I obtain my PhD in counseling psychology. So I am currently I'll be completing my internship at the Michael E. DeBakey VA Medical Center in Houston, Texas. And the internship is like a general internship focus, but I'm really focusing my training on behavioral medicine and rehab psychology.
Wow. Well, congratulations. That's excellent. So I really want to know, how are you feeling about this stage?
Oh, that's a great question. I feel a lot of things. I feel a lot of excitement because I think for the most part, like when I'm going through grad school and different rotations, yes, you do get some agency to pick certain rotations that you get to do. And sometimes, like during my training, there were just some rotations or some training sites that were mandatory. So I'm really excited about like just really getting to have the autonomy to choose what rotations, what training, what research I get to do. And just being at a different site and training in a different area, I'm really just looking forward to just the diversity of patients and clinicians that I get to interact with. So there's a lot of like, I'm the type of person who's really excited about the unknown. I'm like, what is this year going to look like for me? I don't know. Let's see what happens. So I'm really excited. Definitely need some nervousness a little bit, just again, kind of like not really sure what it looked like. But I think generally I'm just really excited. I'm really excited to get started.
Yeah. And this is such a huge step for someone in your early stage of career. So when you kind of look back and reflect on everything that it took for you to get to the stage where you're going to be starting this new internship, I'm just kind of curious, what do you feel like was the seminal moment that kind of like put you on this trajectory? If there's maybe just one you could think of.
Yeah, in terms of my trajectory to like grad school in general or like to my internship?
Internship.
Okay. So I know when going through grad school, internship is the one thing that like they start talking about year one. It's like they first start talking about internship, getting you prepared for internship. So you already start thinking about like generally what type of internship would you want to do? What do you want to focus on? And then it really kind of ramps up once you start the actual process of doing your applications, doing your interviews, prepping for your interviews, and then like having to make that decision. And I think for me, what was like the seminal moment was during my actual interview for the Houston VA. And I just really felt like, wow, this has everything that I want to do. Like this has to rehab, it has behavioral medicine, it has a diversity, it has things that I've never done before. It was the excitement of like, oh my God, like this will be so cool if I get that. So I think that excitement let me know that was going to be a top choice for my training. So I really try my best during the interview to kind of show my personality, show my clinical expertise, my training, and really show like what I'm able to bring to the table. And I'm so glad it worked out because I was able to match, and it was my first choice to this program. So I was really excited, matched here, and yeah, just really looking forward to just the opportunities that I was really excited from like the interviews that I had.
That's great. That's great. So let's give the people a little bit of one-on-one interviewing. How nerve-wracking was that process? And are there any tips, I guess maybe even in general when you're interviewing, that you'd like to impart to people?
Okay, so interviewing, I'm gonna kind of say that I am somebody who tends to be really, really nervous. Like I may come off as confident, like a lot of times, but I tend to be really nervous and I'm really anxious about things. So I think what's really helps me to feel more confident and making sure that I'm able to do well in whatever space I am. It's just being prepared. So I think that's one thing that I like, a tip that I would say is just make sure that you are prepared. And that preparedness can look like making sure you understand what exactly the site that you're interviewing, right? Making sure you're understanding what type of rotations they have, what their training goals are, like understanding like the information you need about the site. And then I think another important part of that preparation is also understanding you yourself and what you have to bring, what do you have to offer? Because you have to talk about that, you have to talk about that confidently. Understanding yourself, what you have to bring, and then being able to succinctly verbalize these things in a way where you can kind of tell your story in a sense to the different people that you're interviewing. So I think that's the umbrella of the preparation for internship was understanding what you want, what your values are, and making sure that the site that you're going to aligns with the values that you have. And then also clinically, are they providing the training that will allow me to go to the next level of whatever I want to do? Right. So to me, it's not just, oh, this is just a place that has good training, but like they have experiences that really aligns with my values and my goals as well. And I can really see this kind of helping me to the next level of my career. So I think really doing that reflection of like understanding who you are as a person, as your values. Do you see that reflected in this institution? It may not be wholly reflected, right? But there has to be aspects of it where you can feel comfortable, where you can feel like safe to a sense of like, okay, this is the type of institution I want to be in. I want to train me, right? So really, exactly, really having that sense is really going to help you to make that decision of like, okay, I think this is a school I might want to go to, or I think these schools might be places that I think I can really get the training that I need.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. And you highlighted two things in just talking about what you need, which is preparation, which I think comes from kind of being studious and attentive, and self-awareness, really knowing who you are and your values. And so I have to ask, have you always had that within you, that sense of preparation and self-awareness, or is that something that you had to learn over time?
I think that preparation is something that's kind of always been with me. And I'm sorry, what was the second part?
Self-awareness that you talked about.
Self-awareness, gotcha. Yeah, I think yes, I do think the preparation and self-awareness has been things that's always been in me, but I will say that it has grown over time. It's not something that was always at the level as it is right now. For example, like if we're going all the way back to like undergrad, right? When I'm still, fresh student, still trying to figure out my footing in this world and my footing in school, I knew that whatever I decided I wanted to do in the end, I needed to have good grades, right? So I always made sure that I got the grades that I needed to get. I always made sure that I did well in school. Always made sure I did extracurriculars and whatever I needed to do. Even though I didn't know exactly what path I was going to, I just knew that I needed to get these bases like down, right? So I was always making sure that I put myself in a position where if I eventually decide that I wanted to do X, Y, and Z, at least I have the baseline to be able to propel me to that part. And I do think that the self-awareness in terms of like making sure that I am in a place that aligns with my values has been something that's been there. But again, it's kind of grown over time. I think in my kind of journey and experience was a lot of like self-exploration of like, where do I want to be? What do I want to do? And a lot of that is the path that I found now is going with what I feel is right for me, right? So like from my undergrad in exercise science to a master's in rehab counseling to a PhD in counseling psychology, all that seems to seemingly different, but like in a way that they're kind of similar in that they have a lot of the same values that
Mhm.
I kind of align with and things that I really found important.
Right.
So the self-awareness, the preparedness has always been there, but I think it is something that's kind of like grown over time for me as I've kind of progressed in my academic work and me as a person.
Right. Amazing. Yeah. And you mentioned journey. So, of course, with all my guests, I kind of like to take it back because we are talking about luminaries in the African space. And so you were born in Nigeria,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And I wasn't clear how long you had been in there, but I'm just kind of curious. Can you talk to me about what it means for you to be, and I think this will actually dovetail nicely into your later research that you've done. But what does it mean to you to have been born in Nigeria, and what do you kind of still take away from that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was born in Nigeria. I was born in Owerri, which is in like southern Nigeria, in Imo State. So I was born in Nigeria, and I was there only for like a couple years. I left at the age of 7 with
Mm-hmm.
my family. So I didn't have a lot of like experiences. I still remember some things in Nigeria, but I was still fairly young when I left. And then so my family left at the age of 7, and then I'm the youngest of 5, so I have a lot of siblings. So we migrated to the U.S. and I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. So that's where I did my elementary school, middle school, high school. Graduated with my bachelor's and my master's from Georgia State. So I pretty much grew up all mostly in Atlanta. But yeah, my first couple years in life, like primary school, right, happened in Nigeria. So I think even though I didn't spend as much like years in terms of like my life in Nigeria, I think my African identity is such a pillar in who I am and the work that I do.
Yeah.
My Black identity, my African identity, my
Mm-hmm.
Nigerian identity is so important to me. I still identify as Nigerian, even though I'm more Nigerian-American, right? Which I also will acknowledge. Yes, I'm probably more American in terms of like culture, but I still identify as like Nigerian first, you know? But yeah, I think that those kind of formative years and just being born in Nigeria really just like it really was a foundation for me in that a lot of the work that I do is focused on like Black identities, African identities, you know, and really wanting to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that I get to a place in my career sometime in the future. You know, right now I'm still pretty early on where I'm
Sure.
able to work with like African populations, Nigerian populations, and really kind of do more like rehab work with African populations as well.
Right. Yeah. And I have to say, growing because I grew up in Atlanta, so I recently was in Atlanta, and I actually go there quite often because I have a friend, shout out to you, Michael, who lives in the area. And every time we're in Atlanta, there's some West African festival going on, whether it's Jollof Fest or something. There's always some kind of party that we go to that is West African inspired. So I'm
Mhm.
curious for you, because obviously I didn't grow up there as a kid. What was it like actually living in Atlanta? And did you kind of get that sort of cross-cultural kind of setting where you got to interact with other first generation African Americans like yourself? And what was that like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that so I'm gonna go forward then go back. So right now, one of my like research interests or just like psychology interests is like acculturation and bicultural identity. And
Mhm.
I think a lot of that has to do with like my experience, right, of coming to the US at such a young age where I don't really have like a lot of awareness in terms of like identity or like because in Nigeria all I knew was I'm Nigerian, everybody is Nigerian. Like I didn't
Mhm.
know anything beyond that, right?
Mhm.
And then developmentally I wasn't, you know, at that I didn't understand in on that level. So coming here in the US and then having to realize my blackness, realize my Africanness, right, in a way that I never had to before.
Right.
That is kind of that culture shock, right? And then having to go through the different layers and the different processes of acculturation from primarily speaking my native language and
Mhm.
having a really, really thick African accent and really having to navigate that in like elementary school where you are othered for everybody's othered in different ways, right? But being in a way that's othered. And I went to majority African American schools. So having to navigate acculturation and understanding like what's going on, like why am I different, but I look like everybody else, and then still learning like a whole new system was definitely an adjustment, an adjustment to being here in the US. But I do say that what was helpful in that acculturation was my culture and just being, and not just Nigerian, because I grew up in a very diverse neighborhood, right? So there was lots of different Africans. One of my sister's very close friend is Ghanaian, so I grew up around a lot of Ghanaians, right? So I grew up, and my best friend is Malian, so I grew up around a lot of different African cultures. I grew up a lot of different like Asian, Indian, just diverse cultures. So I think just being around a lot of immigrants who are also going through their own experiences of acculturation kind of made it easier for me, right? And having that community. So growing up, like, and just having that community of immigrants and such that I was able to communicate with made it easier for me. And then like in my church, there was a lot of Nigerians as well. So I was always immersed in culture. So it really helped that acculturation process for me, and that I was getting exposure to different Africans, different cultural identities, Spanish-speaking identities, and also a lot of like Nigerian, like Igbo, Yoruba culture as well. So that made it, again, easier for me. And I think a lot of my passion for culture, right, understanding culture, understanding how culture affects individual, probably comes from my earlier experiences and kind of growing up in a space where I'm still acculturating to the United States, but having lots of different people who are going through acculturation in their own way, and being able to relate and commune with them was helpful.
Right. And, when you mentioned acculturation, I kind of thought of my own experience in that, being from a Ghanaian family, one thing about Ghana is, of course, everyone is Ghanaian, everyone's Black, but there are sort of different layers to that. There's the Ashanti, the Ewe, the Fantis, and then also Nigeria, Igbo and Yoruba. But coming to America, one thing that I kind of was very much impressed upon, I was born and grew up in America, but one thing that was impressed upon me is, in some ways, you kind of get stripped of all that because you're just seen as Black sometimes, or just Ghanaian. And no one's thinking about, oh, you're Ashanti, you're this, you're that, just you're, Black person with a weird name. Nah, what's that? And I'm kind of curious, since you didn't really have that sort of state environment, but what has sort of been, in your view, the hardest part for you of this idea of acculturation and sort of trying to find your identity within the confines of America? That can definitely kind of like strip you, if you're not careful, kind of like strip you of those sort of like particular cultural identifiers. What has your experience been with that?
Right. So that's a great question, because when I mentioned before, like before in Nigeria, like I didn't understand the concept of like, I think for me in Nigeria, I knew that there were Igbo, there was Yoruba, there was Afik, there were all these different tribes, right? But we're all Nigerian, right? I didn't think outside of that. And then coming here, like I still understood myself to be Nigerian, but yet there is this kind of like homogenous label of Black, right? When we have to write down any kind of demographic information, you have to put down Black, right? And we know that Black means so much more, but then in this American system, it's not. At least, it's not really like what do you say? They don't really go the extra steps to understand the different
nuances,
the nuances of Blackness and Africanness, right? So I think growing up for me, it was hard for me to navigate like my African or Nigerian identity in the beginning, because I'm like 8 to 10 years old when I first came, and then I'm just trying to fit in where I could fit in, just trying to do my best to like get through everything. So I think at first I was like, again, I was struggling. I had my friends, and then what really helped me, and then I'm also understanding a system that not even understanding, but I'm also being introduced to a system that I've never known about. I never had to encounter racism in Nigeria because racism really doesn't exist. There's other isms there, right? There's other forms of discrimination that might happen, tribalism and such, but not really racism. So I think that was something that that was a culture shock, right? When we're talking about culture shocks, something that I had to understand, and not just like racism in terms of like Black folks and white folks and different races, but also internal racism and such like that, right? Within the African community, within the African-American community, right? And really getting my first exposure to whiteness and how the whiteness shows up, right? Because when we're talking about racism, we're not just talking about like the obvious. We're talking about internalized racism. We're talking about whiteness ideology. All these things that I understand now, I had no clue, right? I was just going through it, right? So it made it difficult. And I think the easiest thing to do when you're trying to just be, right, is to kind of like go with the flow in a sense. So what I mean by that is like when I was going through like middle school and high school, like I did my best to kind of like, keep my head down, make sure I did my books, didn't really like engage as much. But when I got into high school and college, I really found myself and my passion in wanting to make sure that like I understood myself and my Blackness and my Africanness. So, and it was also helpful kind of having those environments around me as well. So I like in college was really where it like I blossomed, where I was a part of the like African Student Association, excuse me, and that was like really helpful in just like being on the board for a couple years, being a dance coordinator, really kind of immersing myself in that culture and just making sure that I consistently put myself in different spaces and understood myself as a Nigerian and also understood myself as an American. And I think that over time I was able to better like hone in on what my identity was, but it was definitely hard, I would say, in the beginning in terms of like learning how to navigate all of the isms that you didn't have to experience before you didn't really know what that definition was, right? And even now, as an adult in my PhD, that I'm learning the terms, I'm like, oh, that's what that was, So I'm still learning. I'm still learning. And now that I know and I see it, I think there's even more understanding of different people's experiences and experiences that I didn't really know how to label when I was younger, and being able to educate other people, other Africans, of like what's going on, right? So yeah, that's a roundabout way of answering.
Yeah, I love it. You said something just right there that had sparked a question for me. It's a little bit deep, and then I think we'll move off from the childhood element. But thinking about what you just said, so you're meeting a 7-year-old girl who's leaving Imo State of Nigeria, about to get on the plane, and you have like a minute with her, thinking about everything you've been through. What would you be telling that little girl to prepare for? Like, what could you impart with her as she begins this journey in America?
Ooh, that's a good question. I would say, that's a really good question. I think the toughest part of that 7-year-old acculturation process is just the shock of a different culture. And I don't even, that sounds so like weird, but I think the thing I would tell her is just to like your name, like your name, make sure that you say your name properly and don't let these people mispronounce your name, because that little thing and I feel like all Africans go through this, right? Like the whole name thing, right? Especially if you have an African name, right? Make sure that you tell people how to pronounce your name, right? And make sure that the experiences that you're going through, make sure that you're actually telling either your parents or your siblings, right? Because oftentimes when you first come to the US, the focus is on just making sure, especially in the African community, is the focus is always education, right? Education and making sure you're doing well, which is all great, right? It's good and dandy. But I think something that is missed and to be fair, when you're coming to the US, you're focused on acculturating, you're focused on learning how to navigate this whole new system, right? Your parents are acculturating too. They're going through their own processes, and you're going through your own process as well. But I would love, and this is a clinician in me, right? I would love to have a space where they can talk about what they're going through. We don't talk about what we're going through. We just go through it, and we only talk about school, right? So I would love, even if it was a sibling, talk to your sibling about the weird thing that happened in school, right? Because at least they can talk about it together. Mm-hmm. I think those like little small nuances that, and I'm really like, if there was nuance psychology, that would be me, because I love the small nuances. But I feel like those unique experiences of like, that was weird, or what was that, right? And talking about those things, because those things kind of stick with you. So I think like talking about those experiences and being open and having somebody to talk about those would be really important. So I think that would be the main thing, of just like, like make sure that you correct these people when they say your name wrong and then talk to people about the things that you're going through. Because I think that would have been helpful for me, I would say.
Yeah. There's a famous Nigerian-American actress, Uzo Aduba. I don't know if you've heard of her, but I thought about something she said on a talk show where she said, at one point I was getting bullied about my name. So I asked mom if she could change her name to Zoe. Like, oh, mom, it's easy to pronounce. Americans will get it. Her mom was like just cooking on the stove. She's like, Zoe. She's like, yeah. She's like, listen, if your friends can learn about Gorbachev and Stanislavski, they can definitely Uzo Aduba. So don't worry.
Yeah,
and I wish I had heard that as a kid, because I was like, yeah, that's true. We learn so many, names that are hard to pronounce, and we still have to kind of roll them in our tongues. And I wish I had that confidence at that age. I had a mom who had said it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, and even for me, so my name is Chimdindu. I also go by Chimmy because of the very similar experiences that we talk about. We always felt like we had to like cut our name short for the American tongue so they can understand it, so we can acculture better. And I think me as an adult, I go by both. I go by Chimdindu, which is my name. I go by Chimdindu a lot. And I also go by Chimmy. My friends call me Chimmy as well. So I think at this point in my life, I hold those two names, not because one is easier, but like I genuinely like my nickname and I like my long name as well. But I will say something that, like, when I'm in spaces where I find that people are trying to find a nickname, like if I tell them my name is Chimdindu and they're like, oh, what's the short name? I'm like, my name is Chimdindu. I'm not giving you my short name. Because I'm just at the point, like, you're gonna learn how to say my name. It's not that hard. Let's work on it together. I think now as an adult, like, there's definitely that confidence of like, we're not gonna take the easy way. I do have a nickname, but kind of knowing the experiences that I had, I'm like, no, we're gonna learn how to say my name, and once we get comfortable and once you know how to say it, then I'll tell you my nickname.
Once you're comfortable with your friends. I like that a lot. Yeah. So you mentioned again kind of that transition into more maturity in college, and that's where I kind of want to go now, because your undergrad was in exercise science, and I'm kind of curious, and I'm always kind of curious about the pathway to psychology. What was that spark from exercise science? Not that it's vastly different from what you're doing, but like, what was that spark from I'm saying exercise science to I want to look into this sort of idea of like clinical psychology?
Right. So that kind of started in high school for me. So I had some family members who had like chronic back pain or just chronic pain in general. And two things. One, like, again, growing up in an African household, like, especially as I was getting ready for college, I think my parents were like, okay, do you want to go to school to be a doctor or a nurse? Which one is it? And I'm just like, I'm not interested in neither. Like, but I always knew I was interested in a medical field, but I didn't want to do doctor or nurse. Like, I did not want to do that. So with family members that had chronic pain, I found myself kind of like really curious about like, like the chronic pain and like and really helping them along the way with like what they needed, like them going to their doctor's appointment. I was really curious about like the recovery aspect of like pain, right? Of like rehab and stuff like that. So I remember talking to my sister and I was like, I really want to do something where I kind of help people when they're recovering from things. Cause I can really see how helpful it was to have somebody kind of just be there for you when you're going through something really difficult or like something medically hard, right? And so my sister was like, oh, you should look into physical therapy. And I read about it. I was like, oh, this seems kind of cool. So the best way to get into physical therapy school is exercise science. So that's what I did for my undergrad. I got a degree in exercise science. I did all the things. I shadowed and volunteered. Again, when I said before, like I wasn't quite sure what that end level would be, but I knew that I wanted to make sure that I set myself up well. So I did a lot of shadowing at different like PT, OT, speech clinics, what have you, just to see if, to solidify exactly what I wanted to do in this field. And as I was going through my exercise science major, I realized, I really like physical therapy, but it was missing the aspect that I wanted to do more talking than just like the physical, right? I enjoyed the physical, but I also was curious about the psychosocial. The psychosocial is what brought me to this exercise science major. And I felt like I wasn't getting more of that psychosocial aspect of it. So after grad school, after undergrad, I did some exploring, trying to figure out what I want to do for my master's. And I came upon clinical rehab counseling. And I'm like, oh, this is pretty cool because it really focuses on the adjustment and helping individuals with disabilities and those who have chronic health conditions and disability, and really helping them achieve their goals and their needs. So I did that as my master's, and I absolutely loved it. Like I was in class, nerding out, like reading everything, going to all the things. I really enjoyed rehab counseling. I really enjoyed I did my internship where I worked with adolescents and young adults achieve just like different goals that they had. I worked with a lot of individuals on the spectrum. I worked with individuals like intellectual difficulties, achieving like any we did like social skills training or just academic training or just different things that whatever goals that they had, I really kind of helped them to get there. And I really loved it. And then I really want to continue in this like rehab path. I would really say that my path to psychology is rehab, right? That's where it started for me, was rehab. Because, it was rehab in undergrad, but like a different type. And I did a rehab in my master's. I really enjoyed it. And I really wanted to continue rehab, but I just didn't know like what was the next step. And I had a supervisor that was like, you should consider like counseling psychology or rehab psychology, something like that. I could see you liking it. So again, I opened my laptop, did a Google search, and I was like, oh, this sounds pretty cool. So I again did a deep dive. I fell in love with like the prospect of really integrating more of the things that I was interested in. So those cultural pieces, right? I love, like I mentioned, I really love culture, right? And counseling psychology really focuses on like diversity and culture and cultural humility and all those things. I really enjoyed that. And then I found an advisor that did a lot of rehab psychology work and focused on psychosocial aspects, mental health, physical health, stigma, all of these things that can affect adjustment to a new injury or like disability or what have you. So like I was really excited. So and this was at Virginia Commonwealth University. I applied for the program. I got into the program. And then, fast forward to now, here I am still doing a lot of like the psychosocial work, but in the next level where I've been working as a behavioral health clinician. So really working in primary care clinics. I've worked with caregivers. I've worked with individuals with traumatic brain injury and neurological conditions. Really, again, doing what I really like, which is that psychosocial mental health counseling aspect of it. And then like, I think the more I'm doing this work, it just expands. And I think with any work that you do, like the more you get into it, you find what you like and you expand it, right? So I did all this rehab. I'm learning that I like I love a lot of behavioral medicine stuff because it complements rehab. So I'm wanting to do more of that. I really want to go back to pain because that's what really got me into everything. So I want to do more pain stuff. So like the more you're in the program or the more you're in your field, you start noticing the things that you like and things. And especially now that I'm a trainee, this is my perfect time to explore, like to figure out the things within the umbrella of rehab that I like. So that's kind of where I am right now. But that's what started for me was like really this rehab and wanting to help individuals recover, and then realizing that, okay, I like the physical, but I also wanted to talk to somebody. I wanted to sit with them, to be able to help them, to talk to them, right? And then that's what got me into like my PhD, and then like my rehab psych focus, my behavioral health, wanting to get into that realm a little bit more as well.
Right, yeah. And I know, just because of the work I currently do, a lot of the psychosocial metrics that you talk about, they're kind of rooted in patient-reported outcomes. So not just getting what the clinician is saying or, getting information from a doctor, but let's hear the patient's voice. How does he or she feel on a weekly basis, daily basis? And I looked at some of the measurements you've used in your published papers, and I definitely see there is a theme of really making sure you get self-reported measurements from the patient. And I'm curious, because healthcare is approached through all different kind of avenues and fields, and sort of like there's like a whole puzzle piece to providing good healthcare. But for you, why is it so important in just rehab and what you privilege do to really hear what the patient is saying? Why do you think that element is very crucial in providing holistic healthcare?
That is a great question. So I think this comes from my training in like the science practitioner model, right? In terms of like, I think research is great. Research is what really helps us to do this like macro level understanding of these trends that are happening in different patient populations, right? Research really helps to kind of put everything together. But if we're looking at this like a science practitioner model, the science is, again, the research, the innovation, the conference, all of these things that we do as scientists, as researchers. But we need to make sure that what we're doing is actually true for the people that we're doing it for. Right. So we have to make sure that we are talking to the patients and make sure, like, even when we're doing studies, like you have to do a pilot study, you have to do a focus group, so you can make sure that the measures that you're choosing is actually going to bode well and actually going to reflect the variables that you're wanting to extrapolate, right? So you have to talk to the people to know what's going on. So I think that is what is important for me. And I find myself in both, in terms of like, I really enjoy to do the research to see kind of the macro level of like, okay, I really like longitudinal studies to see what happens over time, right? How does mental health fluctuate up and down over time, right? But also, let's talk to the person, the individual, in terms of like, what does that look like for you, right? And then the individual within themselves, if we're talking about intersectionality, identity, there's so many different factors that can make this person's experience vastly different from the other person's experience. So, and as a practitioner, we're here to help our patients too as well. So I want to make sure that I'm learning how to gather the right resources to make sure that you're actually recovering, right? To make sure that you're actually having the best possible set of clinicians and doctors so you can have the most optimal recovery for you, right? And then that's also data as well. So we know that if we're doing that right, if we're giving the right clinical experiences to our patients, then we can actually gather that data and present that in a way so we can come up with, more best practices and such, So I do really believe in having that science practitioner model and being able to, present the research, but also we have to make sure that we're still there for our patients. We're still talking, we're still getting their reports, To me, it all kind of goes hand in hand.
Right. Yeah. And before I get into the actual work that you've been able to produce from this way of thinking, I love it. And I love what you've sort of done with this sort of practitioner model. I have to ask, because I know you are talked about being molded before. who are your early mentors that kind of put you in the space to think and approach psychology this way? I know you worked in a lab with Dr. Perrin.
Yes.
I'm curious, like, besides him, like, or you talked about him, but like, who are those mentors that really shape the way you think as a healthcare provider?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think going back to like my master's program, so I feel like my rehab science practitioner like identity, my professional identity kind of really started in my master's program. And I think my first person would be that professor, my supervisor that I mentioned that told me you should really think about doing rehab psychology and counseling psychology. And I think she was somebody, I think I really enjoyed having her as a mentor because she was somebody that she allowed me to just talk about all the things I was interested in, right? And talk about and my things included like Black spaces and making sure I brought like understanding social determinants and understanding racism and how that impacts rehab and TBI. Because because I didn't want to just focus on just the condition. Again, I'm interested in the person, I'm interested in the nuance, and I want to be able to bring that in as well. So I think having her as a mentor, Dr. Behrens, just allowed me to really explore my own thoughts, and just having somebody to talk to and somebody that was really encouraging of like just my own exploration of thoughts, right? So that was, I think, what really helped me to dream about what I wanted to do. And then when I think the next kind of mentor and my longest mentor is my primary advisor. One of my primary advisors, Dr. Paul Perrin, because he pretty much does what I want to do, like to the T. Like, I mean, there are some nuances, some variations, but like in terms of really wanting to understand the psychosocial impacts of traumatic brain injury, neurological conditions on marginalized identities, and understanding disability, I think that that's really where I got a lot of my mentorship from, and just like learning all of the variables that to look for in terms of when we're looking at recovery and adjustment. What are some things, especially within the context of TBI, right? And I think, and a lot of my focus, I failed to mention it so far, but I do focus a lot on traumatic brain injury. But that is, I think he helped me to like, number one, I was like, have that as my focus, and really kind of helped me to delve into it a little bit more and understanding the psychosocial aspects of traumatic brain injury, right? So I think Dr. Perrin was really pivotal in deepening my understanding of rehab and disability and adjustment and acculturation, and just kind of giving me exposure to all these different things, right? And then along the way, as a lot of others do, you kind of like find different villages where you just kind of get more information. So I've been able to like find other mentors that has just been helpful in kind of fine tuning just the different aspects of things that I'm interested in. I'm very involved in Division 22 rehab psychology. I'm the co-chair for the African Diaspora Special Interest Group, and that's been great to again kind of fine tune my interest of understanding Black experiences in rehab, right? And being able to connect and network with rehab psychologists and neuropsychologists that are doing this work, and they're more experienced and they kind of know a little bit more, right? So I think just like over time, like I had those two, like Dr. Behrens and Paul Perrin, and even Dr. Sean Jones, my secondary advisor right now, that really focuses on like racial socialization and understanding how that impacts Black youth development. And I think with him, I really learned like in understanding like resiliency factors and how in African populations, which is something that I want to focus more on when in terms of like my research in TBI. And because a lot of research tends to be, unfortunately, a little bit more deficit based, because we're kind of focused on like depression, right? And which is important to make sure we have those metrics, but it tends to be a little bit more deficit based. So I think it's important for me to understand what are the resiliency factors, what are these identities that are these these names, these experiences that does help Black individuals flourish and recover, right? So that is something that was helpful for me to understand more of that positive, more of that coping mechanism for specific Black folks, right? So I think, again, over time, as I've kind of grown in my field, I've just found different people that, and I just kind of curate them and brought them together. So it's nice to be able to do that. But yeah, I think I'm like at this point, and I'm always kind of constantly looking for more mentorship. So like even now that I'm like starting this new phase of my journey, I'm like, okay, I need to find a way to get more mentorship. So I'm like, what do I need to look at? Like, do I need to go to the NIH? Like, what are things I need to look at to get me to the next level of mentorship? Because you just don't know what you don't know. So yeah, I think I've had a lot of good, like solid mentors so far. And I think now that I'm just like, okay, I know there's more work for me to do. I just don't know what's out there. I need more information. So I'm kind of like in this place where I'm like seeking more mentorship to help me get to the next level.
Yeah, I know you'll find it though.
Thank you.
Yeah. So we've been talking about TBI a little bit, and I kind of want to really get to that because little fact about me is that was really my entryway into psychology. So right after undergrad, I started working as a research assistant for this very large NCAA DoD project looking at the effects of MTBI concussions on athletes and military personnel. And I worked with a great neuropsychologist, and as a research assistant, you're just kind of doing the day-to-day work, collecting data, entry, all that. But you're also encouraged to kind of think outside that box and think, what can you do with this data? What can you sort of do to help your academic growth? And so, of course, for me, it was like publish, do conferences. And I was very fortunate to work with a very supportive science staff. And I did present a poster with some of the data we had collected over about a year on the idea of persistent post-concussive syndrome. And these were people who had recurring concussion symptoms like 3 months or a year out. And I focused on just sort of what is like the effective and neurocognitive profile of someone who has this sort of PPCS, persistent post-concussive syndrome. And we found sort of different aspects in terms of like anxiety and PTSD, but it was a very interesting kind of entry into a psychosocial metric of TBI. And so when I was looking at your papers, I was really floored because I was like, I never considered this from the standpoint of U.S. versus foreign born, and I should. I mean, I'm a Nigerian-American. I should have been thinking about all those things. So I really was impressed. I was very, very impressed with your. I read 2 of your papers, and I was like, wow, why did I never kind of think about the implications of U.S. versus foreign born effects of culture on recovery? And so from reading your papers, I would love to know I think I kind of have an idea, but what really even put like that kernel of thought of like, oh, TBI, recovery, and symptomology can be shaped by where someone was born?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm trying to think of where to start. So it kind of goes back to what I was saying before in terms of like, I wanted to merge all of my interests. And one thing I've really been interested in is culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and a part of me is like, I want to get to a place where I'm doing a little bit more like international work and like really looking at TBI internationally, right? So the papers that you're referring to, so I was looking at functional and mental health outcomes in nativity. So like individuals that were born in the US versus those who were born outside the US. So we're trying to see if there are differences in mental health, depression, anxiety, life satisfaction, and typical functional independence measures like the FIM. We're trying to see if there are differences 10 years after they had their hospital discharge. And we're looking at these 2 groups, individuals that were born in the US and they were born outside the US. And what really stemmed that for me was I was working on a research project that was looking at traumatic brain injury in African countries. It was a systematic review where I didn't finish it, but I wish I did. But I was looking at traumatic brain injury or just wanting to get a scope of the literature in terms of like TBI in African countries. So I was
Mm-hmm.
doing a lot of research and just seeing like what the literature is saying and like what's being done in different African countries. And one thing that I've learned is that there was a huge disparity in terms of like the access to resources, the access to the post TBI care. There are huge disparities that are very prevalent in individuals that were born in the US versus the individuals that were born outside the US, right?
Yep.
And then also, if we're looking at all of these different cultures, and you can't look at another country without thinking about how they respond to this culturally, right? So, if we're thinking about mental health, we're talking about depression and anxiety is something that is very culturally bound and something that shifts significantly depending on the severity of TBI. That's going to be received differently at different African cultures, right? So I was really all of that was really kind of like where all of this started, and really wanting to understand like, okay, I'm seeing that people in Ghana or like Kenya or Nigeria don't really focus on mental health aspects or that aspect of recovery after a traumatic brain injury. A lot of the research was just focused on like hospitalization, like metrics, right? There weren't really any focus on a lot of the other aspects of rehab after a traumatic injury. So I think that's what really sparked the like, okay, there's something here. And then I had my advisor, Dr. Parent, who I love kind of bouncing ideas from. And I was like, I think I want to do this for my thesis. I want to focus on looking at nativity, like those who are born outside the US versus those who are born in the US. Are there differences in like functional like outcomes, right, or mental health outcomes? So I did that project for my thesis, and I was able to break it up to two different papers that you were able to see. And I want to say that one thing that stood out for me, at least in the mental health aspect, I think those who were born outside the U.S. had greater life satisfaction than those who were born inside the U.S. And I found that to be really interesting, because that kind of started me in a whole nother like wheelhouse of like this idea of like the immigration paradox, right? That those who are like born outside the U.S. have, a better mental health outcome. So is that what's happening to even here in TBI, right? But then when I was doing more research in immigration paradox, there's more research that's saying that also changes intergenerationally too. So like those who are first generation straight to the like immigrants have better outcomes than those who are second generation, right? So that that really had my wheels going. And it's just so interesting that there are like these nuances that are happening. And then something else that just like as a scientist to just be aware of whenever you're doing any type of research, it's just kind of some of the limitations in terms of like if we're using measures that are looking at like functional independence, we have to make like some of these measures aren't going to bode well for the culture and the language of those who are born outside the US. So is this really actually mapping on to what we're trying to look for, right? So there's a lot of nuance in kind of doing this like bicultural, I guess, work. But yeah, I really enjoyed doing that that study for my master's thesis, and that kind of sent the ball rolling for me, and just really wanted to do more longitudinal work and really wanting to understand like kind of mental health outcomes, physical health outcomes for Black folks. And I kind of like I've narrowed it down more specifically to like, okay, if we're looking at Black identified folks, right, what do these when we're looking at mental health, life satisfaction, how does that change over time? Especially when we're thinking about like what's happening in the US in terms of like systematic oppression. And I don't know, I just had a lot more questions in terms of like, there's nuances that are happening here. What are these nuances? And what parts of that are related to culture? What parts of that are related to discrimination? And that's kind of where my research is like, it's TBI, it's, it's related to neuropsych in a sense, but it's really like the culture part, the nuance. I told you I'm a nuance psychologist. So really, that's really where I get really excited. It's like, okay, what are these things that are happening that really impacts their recovery, their access to these things? So yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So I just want to clarify a point I made just earlier, just in case to make sure this is established, that my previous research was definitely more on mild TBI, so I was just doing concussion. But from reading your papers, I can see like the TBI group that you were involved in were sort of had a more severity. These are people who were victims of a violent injury, assault, or like a vehicular accident. So you really worked with people who had definitely sort of longer term symptomology from their injuries.
Yeah, exactly. So for the papers, the 2 papers for my master's thesis, I was using the traumatic brain injury model systems data set, which is this national data set that's collected from 16 different hospitals, and it's this large ongoing data system that is happening. And I had access to the public data, and majority of the individuals that are used tend to have more moderate to severe traumatic brain injury. And we know that those who have more moderate to severe TBI are more likely to have inflictions and changes and just deal with more concerns with mental health, with depression, anxiety, adjustment, generally to disability. And if we're looking at adjustment and we're looking at culture, there's other things that come into factor as well. So yeah, I tend to kind of focus more on the more mild to severe TBI, because I really do think that's where a lot of things can be missed. And there's I feel like more things, things can be missed and mild. I don't want to kind of say that as well. I think that just over the years, I just tend to focus on more moderate to individuals with really severe TBI, and how are they adjusting, and how are their family adjusting, and how are their caregivers adjusting and such.
Yeah, definitely. First of all, I recommend everyone read these papers. They're really great. And I could never cover everything that you expanded on, but there was a section I really wanted to highlight here, because it really is something I want to know for your future practices. You talk about the idea that sort of the key word in rehab is self-sufficiency. That's the goal, ideally, self-sufficiency. However, there are before and born individuals who might ascribe to a more collectivist approach to rehab, or it's really about family integration. And I found that something that I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I'm sure that will inform sort of your decision making going forward. In terms of, is that something, or I guess not is it, but how is that going to maybe shape how you approach rehab for someone who does subscribe to that approach of, it's not about self-sufficiency, but there's a collective family, especially in our traditional African culture, where it really is about family caregiving, not necessarily about just being self-sufficient.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, right. So when it comes to rehab recovery after a traumatic brain injury, the goal is independence. That's usually what every goal is in PT and OT and speech is getting them as independent as possible. And that's kind of what our training has been here, and kind of what the focus and the goal is, right? So that's where that self-sufficiency. I also think theoretically here in the US or Western society, that's where some of the individualism kind of plays a little bit as well. So that is something that we do hold, because it is true that in order for somebody to be able to recover, they have to be able to do things by themselves, right? They have to make sure that they're practicing these things so that the right neurons are synapsing with each other so that they can be able to recover. That is true. And then we're also talking about the culture, where a lot of people, if we're talking about, let's say, for example, a 30-year-old man from Colombia who just moved to the United States and had a TBI on his way home, right? Who probably, and again, I'm kind of generalizing, creating this experience, but this person that, he may be very enmeshed with his family system, right? And we're talking about TBI, and we're talking about systems and cultures where love and care is shown through doing, right? So we have to be able to communicate to the family that there are ways that you can do that still allows them to reach their rehab goals as well. So it's not just saying, oh, don't do any not reprimanding the family for doing the things, feeding him, doing all the things where we want them to be able to bathe and feed themselves over time. It's not reprimanding the family, but it's educating the family and finding ways to bring the family in as a part of that rehab. That's more culturally informed rehab. That's really kind of where I am spaced in that. It's not just kind of siloing this person, you have to do this, but it's like, okay, family is something that's really important to you. You are a part of a family system. Let's find a way to educate them about this process of recovery and how they can help to optimize their recovery. So that's kind of where I mean, instead of that independence, we're kind of focused more on that interdependence. Let's find a way to bring the family.
Yeah, that interdependence. Yep.
Yeah. So that's kind of where I am and kind of my work with rehab.
Right. Again, amazing insight, amazing sort of openness to explore different avenues and just be aware of how culture really shapes how people can heal. So, I mean, again, excellent work. And so another thing I want to ask you about the work you've done. Like any good author, researcher, you were open about your limitations in the study, which I always great. Humbles me especially. But you mentioned how with the TBIMS sites, sometimes they had Spanish versions of the questionnaires that were being used, but you weren't always sure if they were using additional languages, so they might have only been in English. And I can understand how that's definitely a limitation in terms of if someone doesn't have that kind of language proficiency. I'm really interested in translation work of psychosocial measures. In fact, my previous work was just based on creating psychosocial measures in ethnically minority languages in Uganda. So even though English is the official language of Uganda, but I'm working, in populations and administering depression scales and cognitive scales, how to really translate those scales into Luganda and Acholi and all these sort of dialects. So knowing that it was a limitation in your previous work, I'm kind of curious, and I guess it's really selfishly kind of dovetails into my interest. What ways do you think you can really address the idea of, yes, we need these metrics, we need these sort of standardized assessments they've worked in the past, but what can we do to make sure that people who are coming from other countries are truly taking these questionnaires in a language that they're comfortable in, and how to make sure that in any kind of translation effort, the conceptual equivalency is kept there? I hope that wasn't too big a question, but I am really curious about that.
No, that's a good question. I think what I'm understanding as the question is, how do we ensure that those who are using these measures that don't speak the language, that the measures that we're using is actually tapping on to the construct that we're wanting to measure, right?
Or when English proficiency is a bit like a question, you're not really sure. You really want to make sure that they're comfortable understanding the concept in the questionnaire.
That's a question that I don't have the answer with, but I feel like we're all trying to figure out how we're doing that, because I really do think that is, and not just me, but there's a lot of other clinicians that I've just been reading about that are also kind of in this realm of the world does not revolve around English. There are other languages, right? And we have, and I think, right, to say that a lot of the measures the PHQ-9, G87, a lot of the measures, especially here in psychology, the original measures are based in English. And then there's all of these adjustments, right, that are having to do. And I think it is important. I think I really admire the work that you did, right? Because I think that is so cool. I would love to do work like that, to really work on and adapting measures to different languages. I would love to do more of that. But I really do think that's where the work needs to be pushed ahead towards, and that a lot of these measures are good and they're sound for the culture and the norming population. And there's a lot of work that has been shown that they might be used in different cultures as well. But I think it's wanting to make sure, especially if we're doing a study, if we're doing a study in TBI, right? And we know generally this general information about recovery, and we know generally we have to look at adjustment, depression, anxiety, coping, all these things, right? And we have these kind of typical measures that tend to be tried and true here in Western states, here in populations that it's normed for. I think it's good to have that information. I think if I had to approach it, I would have that information and then go to the people and ask them what's going on over there. Because I think, I don't want to bombard them with all this Western stuff that is good for us and probably has good reliability from other studies and such. But it is important to make sure that the way that they conceptualize depression, it maps onto how it's written or how it's conceptualized in this measure, right? So I think it's talking to the individual and doing a lot of what you were saying, Nana, in terms of like, it's more of that community-based like work. And before we're actually implementing these measures, we have to make sure that it is normed, essentially, right, with the community that we're working with. So I think in your question, in like, what can we do? I think we do have to make sure that we are just kind of going back to the community. We have to make sure that we are like, we know this information and we know that these are things that are going to help with recovery. We just have to make sure that we understand the culture and the nuance, understand the culture of recovery in X, Y, and Z country, right? So we have to understand like who, like, is there shame? Is there like a lot of stigma around rehab or disability or amputation, right? So is there so much stigma that somebody doesn't want to engage in their community? We have to understand what that looks like for that person in that community and understand what are people in that community currently doing. If there are people in the community that are doing things to support individuals who have amputations, what are they doing, right? I think it's just important to just like make sure we understand the communities that we're going into. Even us as Africans going into different African communities, we have to make sure we understand what is going on in the community. How do they conceptualize these things? What does rehab look like for rehab psychologists and neuropsychologists there? What are they doing? And how can we marry this information that we have here so that it best suits the person, right? Because all of this work is for the person. So I think I feel like that's kind of the best approach. Is it has to be like a community-based like collaboration, because just I don't really think it's good science to just take this and just go to another place and administer it, right? I think I think there has to be a certain level of consciousness. And even if you do it, you have to put your limitations in. Like, okay, even if there is not a better measure for stigma for Nigerians, right? So we only have this particular stigma measure. If we're using it, I think that's part of having understanding of kind of the strengths and limitations of the measures that we're using. We can use this and we can list, okay, these are the limitations of this particular measure, and this may or may not bode well, but these are the results that we got, right? I think it's just being more forward with that information, right? Hopefully that answered your question.
100%. For my translation work, it was so multi-layered of doing a back translation, then giving space for all the bilingual people who worked on the project to come together in a focus group. So it was like almost like a little bit of a cognitive interviewing debriefing to say, like, let's really talk about the word choices we use and how they fit in with the culture. And so I love that work. I'm very much involved sort of like the content validity aspects of making sure translated items really sort of are valid for the use they're going to be implemented in. And the amazing thing about when you're doing work is you realize how almost subtle Western influence can be. It can be something like, a questionnaire that's talking about quality of life can say something like, oh, I couldn't enjoy activities such as baseball and soccer like I used to. Well, if we're going to use this in India, let's change baseball to cricket. And let's really be aware of these things because that really does matter. Or, I couldn't run number of miles like I used to. Well, in certain countries, we're going to make that kilometers. We got to really make sure we're attuned to what we're talking about. Be attuned to the fact that some languages don't have certain concepts. So I'm very fascinated by this work. If you can probably tell, if you are going to do any work in translations, let me know because I will definitely be attuned to that work for sure.
Yeah, no, thank you. I might have to go to you for some of this because I'm just like, that sounds so cool. I just defended my dissertation like in May, and what you're saying kind of resonates with like one of the parts of my dissertation that I was talking about. I was looking at, what is my dissertation on? I was looking at global functioning. So again, functioning, and I was looking at community integration outcomes and TBI after 10 years. And we were using TBI model systems data set, and we're using a measure for the community integration. The part is called the participation, the PARTO. That's kind of the short name. But something that was interesting, and I really wanted to make sure that I talked about it, was like some of the, and this is kind of a well-known like aspect of this particular measure, is that, you know, it's not necessarily culturally relevant for different cultures. And it's true, because like if somebody says no on something or one or two items, that can significantly impact their results. And they can be, and the results can say that they're more deficit in their reintegration into community when they're not. It's just again, it's the choice of words that you're putting on there. So if you're saying that, oh, how often do you go to the movies? Do you go to a baseball game? All these things, and you're administering it to to a Black person or an African person or Hispanic or somebody else that doesn't really align with those as activities of pleasure for them, and they say no, that is going to impact their score, right? And and if we're looking at large data like the TBI model systems, and then we're regurgitating information that's saying that Black folks, Hispanic folks fare worse in this measure, that's not true. It's the item, right? So I think that's what's really important about the like translational work, and making sure that we're using these measures because, like, one, we're using the measures because that's what is available right now, but also being forward and making sure you're talking about some of the limitations that comes with the measure. So we're being open about this in terms of like, this is what we're using. We're working towards getting better measures done. This is what the data is saying, but just kind of, again, having those limitations out there. But I think it's just so interesting, especially when we're looking at the item differences, and particularly like, what is accent and who is this accent is for? I'm like, this is not something that we do, you know? So it's so interesting to me.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So I want to end us on maybe not so much a question, but I have a little bit of a commentary for you, which is, from one of the reasons I was so excited to interview you as a luminary is, again, you're in your early stages, but from reading about you and reading about your work, you're doing what I think is so important in our community, which is you are really shining a light where that doesn't often get a spotlight. And you're really making an effort to address communities that are often marginalized in healthcare and just in our society. And I think that's so important that that's going to be your life work and what that's going to carry into your career stage, that you're really focusing on populations that just don't necessarily get this sort of healthcare resource, or is taking for granted that everyone in the U.S. Kind of gets access to the same kind of resources, and that's not true. And you recognize that, and you're really working to address that. And then on an international stage, there's so many implications for that, like what you can do to reach out to people where even within their particular infrastructure in their country, this just doesn't exist. And I think that's a huge honor that you're bringing a voice to the voiceless. I think that is amazing. And how do you feel about that? That you are in a space where, and again, I kind of looked up this idea of nativity, and there isn't that much research being done. There are a few publications similar to your own, but really it's like I think there's a paucity. And so in whatever you end up doing, you're going to sort of be the lead. You're going to be the expert, the forefront,
right,
the go-to person. And that's a huge honor and a huge responsibility, and that you're bringing that voice to the voiceless. And I just want to know, what does that mean to you? And how do you sort of carry on that crown in terms of like how you're going to be an inspiration and be someone who leads this effort? What does that really mean to you?
Because I think I love asking the questions that a lot of people are not asking about. It's just my thing. Like and going back to one of my mentors, Dr. Perrin, like I remember a conversation I had with him where like I would often get frustrated at the measures because they weren't they weren't necessarily the best for the questions I'm asking. And he was like, one unique thing about you is Chimmy is that you ask really unique questions, which nobody is asking, which is great. But something that you're going to come across is like, the world as it is right now is not at a place where they're asking the same questions as you're asking, right? So it's a challenge, but it also makes me really excited because I think people, fortunately, I'm really blessed that people really gravitate towards my work because I'm asking a lot of these nuanced questions and different spaces and different things that I do that a lot of people aren't asking so forthright. So I'm really excited because, again, I love asking and trying to understand what's happening for marginalized people as they're recovering. How does that impact them? How does that impact their family? It makes me really excited, but it also, one part of me, it makes me really excited. And another part of me is just like, I don't know what to do. Like, I don't know, because I think for the things that I want to do, there's no building that's already set up, right?
Blueprint, I'll think of
There's
it,
no blueprint. Exactly. Thank you for that. So it's like I'm trying to figure out, how do I do these things I want to do? I literally think about it all the time, Nana. Like, I'm just like, okay, who do I go to? How do I be a rehab psychologist, but also do this international work? I also have a lot of interest with veterans. Like, how do I fit all of this in? What does this career actually look like? I have no clue. So I think that's the part that's a little like, I wouldn't say frightening, but it's kind of like, I don't know how to put it all together. And I think that's always been me in terms of like, I need to like, I have to find a way to fit all of these things that I'm interested in. And I always find a way to do it. But I'm just at a place right now in my career where I'm kind of at that next level of, okay, I'm working on being this rehab psychologist, but I really want to pull in more of that international work. I really want to pull in and find out, how do I actually network with different African universities so I can get connected with them, so I can do get my foot in to do more research there. Like, how do I do these things that I want to do? Because the passion is there. The passion's always been there. It's just trying to figure out, how do I actually grow it? And I think the more that I am myself and I just look things up and I cold call people and just trying to find, okay, I have this purpose that I believe I have in this space and in my career. It's just like, how do I find the community? So I think that's the scary part of like trying to do things that's a little bit outside of the normal bubble of rehab psychology. But I think, again, it's just me kind of following my passion. Like I said in the beginning, it just kind of grows over time. It's grown to this point that I am right now. But I think I'm wanting to like expand it more and like actually I would love to do translational work. Like, I've never really done a whole lot of that. I've done some research papers here and there. I love to dive more into that. I just have a lot of interest, Nana. And I'm just like, how do I create this into my own world? So I think it's exciting and it's a little nerve-wracking a little bit because I'm not sure what that looks like. But one thing that my mentors have told me is like, you don't have to do this overnight. You're going to figure it out. You have your career to figure this out, just focus on what you can for now. So it's exciting. And I know that I'll get there one day. When I'm able to get all those things.
Right. Yeah. What you described definitely sounds like a very long and winding path, but I would implore you to think of it as divinely guided steps. And this one step you have is going to be Houston, of course. And I just can't wait to see what the next steps are for you. I know you're going to be successful in what you do.
Thank you. I appreciate it. No, I'm definitely super excited to be here in Houston. I do feel that it's going to be a great stepping stone to the next places, just kind of based off of everything. So yeah, I'm just really looking forward to all the opportunities that are going to come with it and all the things to be done in the future.
Wonderful, as you should be. Chimmy, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. And I learned so much, and I can't wait for my audience to learn more about you.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Have a good one.
All right.